Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Well, welcome everybody, and I am super pleased today to be with Robert Greenwald. That name may not be one you're familiar with, but Wikipedia is familiar with it. And if you'll indulge me, Robert, I'm gonna point out highlights. And if I leave any highlights out that you really want mentioned, then please do add them. So Robert started in New York, went to high school for the arts, and started a career in the theater as a director, and then for that ungodly reason that affects so many people, headed out to Los Angeles and Hollywood, and where he still was directing theater, and then made the move to television and film. And although the name Robert Greenwald may not come immediately to mind, I guarantee you've seen some of his films. 25 Emmy nominations, 2 Golden Globe nominations, Peabody Award, the Robert Wood Johnson Award, and in 2002, Producer of the Year by the American Film Institute. And so, I mean, really, already, if you stopped right then, it'd be a lot. But then and many TV programs and movies. And then in 2002, I think it was, you made the leap, or at least according to this, you made the leap to documentary films. And let's talk about that afterwards. But some of the films that many people have seen, the trilogy, right? Unprecedented, Uncovered, and Unconstitutional. Unprecedented, the year 2000 presidential election. Uncovered, the whole truth about the Iraq War. And Unconstitutional, the war on our civil liberties. But also Make a Killing, the war on whistleblowers. I mean, there's just so many. My favorite, actually, or at least the one that I think affected me the most, was the Walmart film, right? The high cost of low prices. And apparently it affected Walmart quite a bit too. I remember it made it to as many mainstream outlets as I remember. And they were not happy, which I think is a great achievement. Now, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to Robert Greenwald, which Truth in Advertising I do on a relatively regular basis, because I am on the board of Brave New Films, and proudly on the board of Brave New Films. And I think Robert Greenwald is, I know I've said this before, I think you're a genuine hero. The things you do are really spectacular and important. And so now my first question. So I understand why somebody would make the leap from Hollywood to making documentary films in your own shop, but only because I'm not in Hollywood, and I don't, right? I mean, I just have stereotypes of Hollywood floating around in my mind. But was there a precipitating event? Was it a life? What brought that decision? By all intents and purposes, you could have gone on doing what you were doing indefinitely. And some of the films you made were super powerful and important. And although not documentaries per se, they certainly brought real issues to the forefront. So why the change? Why the felt sense that you needed to do that or wanted to do that?
Well,
Welcome. And welcome.
thank you. It's nice to be here, and thank you for being on the board of Brave New Films. David has been an invaluable resource and an important part of the board and Brave New Films as we figure out our direction going forward at a time of humongous change in so many ways. So that's much appreciated. I made the change because I guess it was three factors, two very specific and one more general. Specifically, the things that happened were 9/11. And I remember very strongly my sense, as you know, David, I've got 4 kids, and a lot of the decisions I make are around the kids. And after 9/11, our country so quickly moved from grief and pain and suffering to revenge. And it was fairly scary, and it was troubling. And I thought, not that I was going to change the world, but certainly in terms of the future life of my children and what they were going to be able to do or not do, I wanted to be having some kind of impact. And clearly we were at a huge turning point right then. The second fact, so that's sort of maybe general, if you will. The second factor was the death of my father, which was right around that time, which I remember very clearly. We did a memorial service for him at our home here, and I can visualize, because I'm a director, that's what I do. I can visualize myself sitting off to the side, other people were speaking, and I'm thinking, well, what am I going to say about him that's somewhat accurate? Like all parents, he was not perfect. Like all human beings, he was not a saint by any stretch of the imagination. So I wanted to say something reasonably meaningful and accurate. And it hit me right then that one of the wonderful things he'd passed along, not sure how, was the notion that you do something beyond your own narrow self-interest. You can, you have one car, one house. What do you do beyond that? And that sort of realization at that time, 9/11, the death of my father, this value system, combined with understanding, because I'd been working in commercial film and TV for so long. And thank you. Yes, I've been able to get some films through the system that had social meaning, but ultimately it's a system based on profit. And if you work for Paramount or Universal or NBC or TriStar, your job is to make a good film, but it's also to make profit. And profit is often, as we know, in conflict with values, in conflict with narratives, in conflict with decision-making. So I was moving in this direction of these three things, of wanting to do something differently. And I was so fortunate because I was very successful in commercial film and television. So I didn't have the financial pressure that most people have.
And did you get, did a lot of people sort of try to pull you back? What are you doing?
Well, the system in Hollywood or in all commercial entities, it's surrounded with people who make a living from that, agents, managers, lawyers, and to a varying degree, they thought I was insane. Why did I have to do it? Why didn't I just write a check to a charity or something? And there are people who, at a sort of more fundamental level, they define themselves by how much money they make, how much money their clients make. So it was almost a sense of identity for some people. Well, if you're not making dollars and you're not measuring yourself by dollars, how do you keep score? Which was not a problem I had, but certainly I can remember particularly one really, really smart, wonderful lawyer, and he did his best to talk me out of it. And fortunately for me, he wasn't able to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? It's that pull. It's almost like an act of an act of difference is sometimes interpreted. Nobody asks somebody who's going with whatever counts as the flow to explain themselves. But an act of difference almost feels to many people like it's an argument against that. And maybe it is, maybe there's an element of that, but as if somehow, what are you? You're deserting us. It's kind of, it's kind of like when someone transitions, from male to female, female to male, this to that. It's dealt with not just as that person's felt need, but as a challenge to, are you telling me that I should too? And was there an element of that for you? I mean, was there a sense that you were leaving something that wasn't doing enough of the kinds of things you thought were important to do? I mean, certainly you felt like you couldn't do enough of those things, but was there an element of critique in it?
Well, I can't answer for others. Certainly,
Right.
one pebble in the ocean, if I was even a pebble. I do remember talking to people about a book my brother had given me. He's a psychologist, and he gave me a book called Wealth Addiction, a very short little book, and it makes the case very simply. Wealth addiction is another form of addiction, like drugs or food, or because what is an addiction? You can never have enough, and no matter how much you have, you're thinking about the next, the next conquest, the next drug, the next drink, the next deal. And it's not that many of the folks don't need the money. They have more money than their great-great-grandchildren can use. So why, when they get up in the morning, is the focus almost exclusively on maximizing dollars themselves? So it becomes about identity, measuring, and an addiction. So that I found that really helpful, and it helped because ultimately I had to do it first. It helped me break the hold that it had on me, which was, I would say, less addiction, but more about measuring. Oh, I did the 5th movie this year, and I made this money, and those, less than pure things that we all are subjected to.
Yeah. Well, and I you may feel uncomfortable about this. You may ask me to take this out in the editing process, but I've always, when I learned that, Robert Greenwald does not take a salary at Brave New Films. Everybody else takes a salary. It's a business. It's a nonprofit, but it's a business. But that you don't, that's a statement in and of itself. And you may not be making that statement, but it is something that it's more than one person, including myself, admires. So, yeah.
Thank you. I felt that if I was smart and thoughtful, I wouldn't need the dollars to, pay for food on the table. But maybe as importantly, when I moved into the nonprofit world, then there comes fundraising. Well, I'm not a great fundraiser to begin with, but if I was raising money, and I remember this very clearly, early on, Andy Stern and Anna Berger, who ran SEIU, were wonderful supporters of what I was doing, and they gave some contributions from SEIU, the union they ran. And I remember thinking, what, I'm going to take money from healthcare workers and from janitors to pay myself? I can't do that. So that's partly when I evolved and saying, well, I'm not going to take a salary, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm not an idiot about how I spend my dollars. And Hollywood overpays you. And what I was doing, again, I was fortunately very successful. I made a ton of television movies, and they were, insanely lucrative.
Yeah. Were there any movies that you wish when you look back, you don't have to tell me what they are. I mean, I actually am fond of, I know Xanadu was not was not a raging success, but it was successful in that that was the impetus for the Razzie Awards, the beginning of that. But are there movies when you look back that you sort of go, geez, I wish I hadn't done that? Not asking you to name them, but
yeah, there are movies that are pretty awful, but there aren't a lot of, maybe there's one or two that sort of in retrospect go against the value system. That's a more, everyone makes shitty movies, and sometimes you try to make a good movie, make a bad movie, and sometimes going in, it's shitty, particularly with television movies. And some of them were, purely commerce. So I don't feel bad about those. The one or two that were on the thin line of going against values are the bigger issue.
Sure, absolutely. I understand that. So, okay, so fast forward, you make this leap to Brave New Films, and did you have a clear mission in mind when you started, or was there a particular, I want to make this movie? And
I'm the opposite of having a clear vision in mind. I mean, truly the opposite. And many of the challenges over the years was because there was never a mission, there was never a clarity, there was never a plan to have a company. I mean,
but I get that might be, that they may have taken a while to formally be put in place, but they were guided. There are sort of, one can discern guiding principles, and over time, perhaps they've crystallized. But I take it they were not there. Was there a like first film that you were burning to make?
Well, the first documentary I made was about the war in Iraq, and it was about the fact that we weren't being given the real story. And I remember very clearly reading the stuff, in just a few small periodicals, because many people weren't around then, weren't born then, weren't involved then. But it was a pretty scary time in that no dissent was tolerated of any kind. And here, as I started reading, there was some former CIA folks and others, ambassadors, who said, no, we're not being given the real reasons for the war in Iraq. So at that point, I made the shift and said, well, I'm going to try to do this as a documentary, rather than figure out some concocted narrative fictional storyline.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just went forward, and then March to Bankin and Earl Katz and other people helped me raise a few dollars. And I didn't need money. I had the office, I had the editing machine. So, I was able to do it for almost nothing. And then I remember the first screening so well. I was at the Laemmle Theater in Los Angeles, and I'm in the car with Heidi and my daughters, and we're driving to the theater about a block and a half away. And I look down 2nd Street, and I see a line all around the block. And I turn to Heidi and I said, oh shit, there's a film premiering tonight. And, we're not going to be able to get our few people in through the damn line. Well, it turned out it was the line for the Iraq documentary. Wow. Because there was such a hunger.
Oh, wow.
Because, MSNBC or blogs, none of that stuff was around. So there was a real hunger. And at the end, in this small, dark theater, people stood up, and a standing ovation, which, was quite something. But then afterwards, the true turning point, because I'd done a lot of movies and some people loved and some they didn't love. And this was particularly loved, but people came up to me, and it wasn't good or bad movie. They said, thank you for making this film.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a light bulb went off. I said, wow, wow, that's very different. How interesting. And then that started me towards, well, I'd like to do more documentaries. How can I raise money for them? Where can I find money? One part. And then the other part slowly started developing an expertise among researchers and editors and social media people, and Jim Gilliam, who was one of the early executives with Brave, even before we had executives. He, I hired him to be a researcher, and he was just absolutely brilliant. He died a few years ago, but brilliant guy. So so there was this expertise, and a couple of different people said to me, well, you should try to have a company so you can hold on to these people and this expertise. I said, well, how can I have a company? We're not going to make any money. I mean, I said, well, maybe you can raise some. And so that began the movement towards a company.
Got it.
I think there was 3 of us: Jim Gillian, Devin Smith, myself.
Wow.
And then it grew.
Yeah, indeed. And where do the ideas come from? Like how does Brave New Films how does Brave New Films decide, which is to say, how do you decide, or are there other voices? There certainly are other voices, but the decision buck stops someplace, and I know it's there. But how do you decide? Because there's no shortage of issues. There's no shortage of important issues. So how does one select? Or is it just, it's juicy for you?
Well, it's a really critical part of my job. And if you look at even though we're very different, we are a production studio. And like a studio, there's always has to be one person or several people who have the ability to, quote, green light something.
Right.
So I take that responsibility very seriously, because every time I say yes, it means saying no to an increasingly long list of companies and groups and issues and concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more art than it is science, the decision making. And certainly the people in Brave New Films, we discuss, we argue, we debate. But I try to do a couple of things, not always successfully. So one is looking at whatever issue we take on as systemic. How do we connect the dots so that people understand the Walmart film? This was a real constant struggle. It's not about a bad boss. It's about a system based on maximizing every dollar, no matter the toll on individual people. Mm-hmm. Or the Koch brothers, similar thing. Or the various films we did on the wars. I went to Pakistan. I interviewed drone survivors. It was a profound experience. And people whose grandparents and friends and relatives were killed by our drones. But even if we stopped drones today, it wouldn't have stopped the war machine. So how to do drones, how to do the Koch brothers, how to do voter suppression, so that people understand, without it being boring and without it being spinach or homework, here is a story putting a face on policy, is what I often say now, a human face on policy, which is something we can do that many others don't do. But if we can do it effectively, you can touch the heart and the soul, and I believe create more impact.
Do you think that insight, because I think, that's obviously, I love it. I love the work. It's very touching. Frequently the films, yes, they're documentaries, but they're also deeply touching. And do you think the reason many documentaries feel like spinach or homework is because they're not informed by whatever that was that that you either came with or absorbed through the, like if it's a terrible story, right? If it's a terrible story, it's usually a terrible movie, right? Or it's the telling of, or maybe there's a story there, but somehow somebody told it from a point of view that where it almost didn't even seem like it was about human beings. And you have you, Brave New Films, you have this unique, I don't know if it's unique, you tell me, but it just feels like it does. It feels like it's always a personal or personal stories, but it's not just, it's always a personal story that's about an issue, right? Or many personal stories that are so clearly directed at an issue. And so it often feels like I'm not really watching a documentary, you know, a spinach documentary. I'm watching I'm getting an insight into human beings' lives. And yes, it's this one, but it's many of them. And you know, maybe that's, you know, I'm sure it's not unique, but or no, I take that back. I'm sure it's not the only place that happens, but it's certainly the I can't think of others. That's something you try to do.
Oh, kill myself trying to do. No, yes, it's very intentional. It's very difficult. And part of it is, there's several parts. So one part is in the progressive universe, for whatever set of reasons, there's a conventional wisdom that if only we had another PowerPoint with another 10 facts, we would convince people of why we are right and the other side is wrong. Well, as I've said, I believe you start with the heart and then you get the brain. And that makes a big difference versus many people, smart colleagues, good people, who say, oh, you only had 10 points? No, you need 20 points to convince them. 20, you need 30 points, which I mean, people can do that, and maybe it does affect some people. Carl Jung talks about feeling function and thinking function people. And these films that we do almost always start with feeling function, and that means finding the human beings. So on voting suppression, I decided to do voting suppression when I thought it was just going to be a 5-minute short, and then it grew and grew and grew. The assignment to the incredibly talented folks was, we need people who were denied the right to vote. In Walmart, we need people who were screwed over. Then it gets into an area of, and this is dicey and challenging, they may be incredibly good stories, but they may not be good on camera.
What do you mean by that? What does that mean?
They may fump. They may come with every other sentence is, well, you know, or they may.
Oh, you mean the individuals who
Yeah.
you interview are no?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So the process of choosing, and I haven't found that, we still call it casting. I don't like that word, but we haven't found a better word yet. So on every single one of the films, voting suppression, or the recent one around racial, charged around misdemeanors, or the Koch brothers, or whatever it is, it's always almost always finding the people who center it. And it's almost like I see us putting on top of these people the stories and the issues, but we need them to take us into that world. And even with that clarity of philosophy and approach, it's still very, very hard to find the people, to make sure that they in fact are multidimensional human beings, but they're not talking points disguised in a suit, jacket, or a skirt, you know, and that they are people who
spinach dressed up as something else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not pundits, you know, and sometimes even when we're doing interviews, some of the, field producers or some of the people themselves will start expanding like they're pundits. And I'll say, no, tell me why you are hurting because your son was shot. and by a gun that never should have been around, versus, giving me some more abstract notion.
Mhm.
I remember in the film about the NRA, it was one of the most extraordinary moments. I never thought we'd find this story. I'd set a goal of 6 different stories, each exemplifying a different part of the problem with guns, and then finding the human story. So one of them was a parent whose child had been killed by a gun that had been left around. We found a mother, and she was willing to talk because she didn't want her son's death to be in vain. And in talking with her initially, she was very nonverbal, and somebody had given her a few talking points.
Mm.
Anyway, I can't remember, I said it politely, and she was clearly in such terrible pain. The next day, she called me and she said, well, I went to the house. I can barely talk about it still.
Mm.
Says, I went to the house when my son was shot, and I videotaped myself outside that house. Would that be of interest to you? And it's like, just on every level was an amazing moment, but it was led by the fact or philosophy or approach of it's the humanity that takes us in.
Mm. You obviously get critique. I don't know if it's critique, but it's criticism. Well, it's so one-sided, Robert. It's so one-sided. And have you ever made a film about it, walked into a film about an issue with a particular point of view, and had that point of view changed, given more texture, more nuance, more whatever, so that it felt, you discovered that the other side, for lack of a better way of putting it, that other sides were important to put in the film as well, or that, which is really a question about where do these values come from, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that line, which I just love, right? There's various sources have described Greenwald's political act as left wing,
Yes, well, I take that description proudly. The notion of showing both sides and that the truth is someplace in the middle is, to me, an ideology, and it's a biased point of view. The bias is the middle is always where we should be. That's a bias. I don't accept that bias. I don't accept that, all left-wing bias is the solution, or all right-wing bias, but certainly the convention, and we see it in the, with the poor press every day trying to figure out how to talk about it, where clearly you have a whole political party now lying about the election. So how do they then try to say, well, the truth is really in the middle? So I don't feel I do feel an obligation to tell the truth. I don't think ever we've been attacked for our distorting the truth, but every film is a selection process, and what you select to choose and focus on means you're not focusing on something else.
Have you ever walked into a film and thinking that, no, I take that back. Have you ever walked out of making a film sort of because the truth you walked in with turned out not to be so? Or do you do that research in advance, or that assessment in advance, so that you've already thoroughly digested the spinach before you start making it?
Yeah, you see these small sampling of books behind
Yeah.
it. That's my the research is an incredibly important part before. So let's talk about, for example, you mentioned the NRA film, guns, the making a killing. So
yeah.
That was actually my wife's suggestion. Please do something about the NRA. said, well, hasn't everything been done? So I started reading, and yeah, there's, a certain amount has been done. But what hadn't been done was tying the NRA to the profit motive of the gun companies. So before starting, I researched and saw what else had been done, because with limited resources and an obligation, a social justice obligation, I want to make sure we're not doing what has already been done. And most of the time, nobody wanted to touch drones. I mean, I laugh because not only was it going to Pakistan, but it was criticizing Obama or the Afghanistan war when went to Afghanistan. So people were happy we were doing it, and even though almost nobody else was. But on some of the other issues, it's a little bit, I don't know if dicier is the right word, but this is a good example. So not the most recent film, which was voter suppression, but the one before that on misdemeanors about the justice system. So Alexander Natapov, who wrote this great book, 12 to 13 million Americans are enmeshed in the incarceration system because of misdemeanors. So when I first read that, I thought, oh, this is a mistake. Can't be that many people. She meant 1 million or 1,200,000. So that led to me exploring and reading and talking to her, and then meeting with the team and saying, can we tell a story? Can we put a human face on it? So this was interesting because people, there are millions of people who've been screwed by the misdemeanor system, but there are not many of them who want to talk about it. Why? Partly because they are marginalized and they are struggling just to pay the rent or get a job or keep their head above water. And partly there's a lot of shame involved, that they were trapped in the. So it took us an amazing amount of time to find those stories of people who it was an authentic story. It was real, where there would be audience sympathy, and they were willing to talk to us. And even
they were good on camera.
And they were good on camera. And even then it wasn't enough. It's when I ultimately had the idea to juxtapose the misdemeanors of today from the so-called crimes of the past, so that people could understand the long line of systemic racism that was motivating this.
Yeah. That's exhausting. That's hard work. It's hard work. The other thing is, I think is worth saying, and rather you say it than I say it, but so for instance, I know you made films, I know you made some things about Trump, but you didn't pile on, and there was no feature film, and there was, right? So I mean, I think one of the things that it's certainly one of the reasons I think Brave New Films is in a different place from other folks that do documentaries. If other folks are doing it, I mean, it's like everybody's doing Trump, right? Every comedy show, every news, right? Right? Everybody, whether it's one side or another, there's so much out there, whether people believe it or not is whatever, but there's so much out there that you choose things that people haven't done or nobody is doing, and yet it feels important. And I think that's got to be a conscious decision, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, no, one of the first questions when I'll have an idea will be, somebody will spend a few days, what else has been done in this universe? Let's find out, to make sure maybe there's the hard part is there's not a system where what films are coming down the pipeline. So, but sure. You can certainly do due diligence and check around and make sure. What is Amy Goodman has a great line, to go where the darkness is, right. Which is another way of saying it, maybe more poetically. But no, we spend quite a bit of time early on to make sure that it hasn't been done. And then are there advocacy groups more time and energy is now spent on distribution than even the making of the film. Now we're a very small company. We've had to cut down, as you know, because of financial pressures. But even then, even in a small company, distribution, how we're going to reach people, and then the use of a constantly changing series of platforms as ways to reach people. What you do on TikTok is different than slightly different than what you do on Instagram, which is different than what you do on Facebook, which is different than what you do on YouTube. So it's complicated, but fascinating.
Yes. And I mean, I think that maybe you did just speak about it, but I think that that's one of the things that I know I don't remember if I've heard it or read it, that Brave New Films has been, I don't know if they're unique in it, but have offered insights to others about distribution and where and how that's moved the ball forward in a significant way. Because, hey, you can tell the best story in the world. This might become the best interview in the world, but if nobody sees it, what's the big deal, right?
Yes.
So,
no, exactly. And it's hard because in film, the tradition is you want to make your movie and then somebody else takes care of getting it out there. And it's actually, for us, the opposite, because so from day one now, even in a much smaller universe of staff, distribution is involved and social media is involved. And we're talking early on, how are we going to reach and what are we going to do and how are we going to get an audience? And that's starting to pay off.
Does the loop change direction? In other words, does distribution challenges sometimes shape what you're doing?
Oh, yeah, very much so. So, for example, we're now trying to do Suppressed and Sabotage 2022, which will be using some of the bones of the initial Suppressed movie and then filling it out with what's going on today.
Right.
So distribution has created an advisory council, 15 groups who are deeply involved in this issue. They know more about it than we do. They will always know more about it than we do. And we would be idiots and schmucks if we didn't take advantage of that.
Sure.
So the advisory council is meeting with social media, is meeting with our screenings new person, Carmen, who's wonderful, and is meeting with Casey, our head of production. So it's all coming together in the most organic fashion. I don't know if organic's the right word because it's organized, but in the most planned fashion, and it's being affected by what we're hearing from those groups.
Right. That seems super smart. And from the little I know, not everybody's doing that.
No, it's a lot of work, so if we've got, one staff person, how do you divide her time? Because Chase, everyone's busy, everyone's doing important work. So it takes time and effort. But I do think it's very important. Way back on the Walmart days, I remember we had a meeting with our courtyard, and I can still visualize it. Maybe 20 different groups all working on different aspects of fighting Walmart. This was about 6 months before the film was finished, or maybe even before we started. And it was so important to get their understandings, to get their perspectives, to make sure we were covering as many aspects of that issue as we possibly could, right? Because Walmart was an equal opportunity abuser in so many ways.
Right.
So we had to really zero in on which stories to tell, even within Walmart, and which ones to let go.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you're looking at the time, and I don't want to take too much of it, but are you ever not on the left?
Ever not on the left?
I mean, do you find yourself? Are you ever not? Well, in the camp that gets called progressive?
Yes.
Would you be willing to?
It's a long conversation, but And even the
I
use
got
of
time.
words, the use of words is so challenging that
Yes.
I guess this has been marked by mainly by the right, but I guess what's been called cancel culture would have me in a different camp. What's been called people, maybe this is a version of it, but people who have been accused of doing bad things have been, in my opinion, prematurely penalized without any sense at all of justice, of fairness, legal system, or even a voice
Or scale.
Yeah.
Or, right. Sure.
Yeah. Proportionality.
Proportionality.
What was
right.
that? If somebody 10 years ago posted a stupid, disgusting thing on Twitter or on a blog, yes, stupid, disgusting. But as someone who works a lot on incarceration issues, we're constantly saying we can't judge people by the worst thing they did, even when it was killing somebody, even if it was when they did terrible, really bad things. So I'm definitely not, I'm sure I'm in well, I don't know, but I'm not in the conventional liberal camp. Maybe
Yes.
I didn't say that.
Yeah. 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 It's an interesting thing to find oneself in strange rooms with different people.
Yeah. And then, the civil liberties issue, where do you draw the line on free speech? Even that's changing somewhat. And I'm sort of more on the purist side of that versus some of other folks who say, no, that it's too dangerous to allow X or Y to speak.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. Well, I know that territory.
yeah,
And,
yes.
and feel it as well.
Yeah.
Has Brave New Films, so, some people would say, many people would say, look, one of the most challenging things happening right now is the inability of people to speak to each other. That the camps are so at odds, and so bounded camps, right? Have you ever given thought to a film or films that seek to bridge that divide?
No.
Tell me about that.
Well,
is that question sacrilegious?
No question is sacrilegious. No, I think part of it depends on how you define the divide. I believe the divide is now moved to a stage of tribalism.
Yes.
You're not going to convince somebody from another tribe in any use of rational, reasonable thought process to give up their tribe. It's almost like trying to convince a sports fan to switch teams. It's just not going to happen. But more importantly is that, look, there are fundamental differences. I think the issue of inequality in our country and racism are extraordinary fundamental differences. They can't be healed by let's all get together and sing kumbaya. So I don't think you can bring the two together. I think the question—
Certainly those two.
Yeah.
Right. Certainly those two.
But those two, to me, are probably the fundamental issues that are ultimately tearing apart the country in many ways. Is racism worse than inequality? You put the two together. I don't have an answer to that. There's a stack of books that I'm going through to understand better. But I think that if you accept the power of those two divisions, race and class, or race and economics, they're not healed by bringing the two groups together. So I think they are healed by— healed is the wrong word. I think the more exposing of those issues, the better. And the more exposing hopefully leads to not just electoral change, because the other part of this conversation is electoral versus social movement, and how do the two work together. And I have been pre-Trump more on the side of social movement creating change, right? Peace movement, civil rights movement, women's movement, labor movement, none of them waited around for the perfect electoral candidate to create change. Trump is, I think, sadly, or maybe he's an outcome of social movement forces, has redefined some of that. So it's caused me to rethink quite a bit and to try to understand better what can we do that will be impactful in a changing time. Now, everybody thinks their era is changing, yada, yada, but certainly a case can be made that we're at an extreme point right now.
It feels like we're at an extreme point, and it's you know, I mean, you and I have spoken. I think we've spoken about this. I mean, it's a unique, the change that I made moving from California to moving to Wyoming has been eye-opening in so many different ways. I don't think I've forsaken any of my values. But I'm also struck by the amount we seem to have in common with people who on certain issues I have nothing in common with. And it's, you know, it's for me, it's something I don't have a lot of insight into yet, but it's so compelling. And I don't want to say it's intriguing. I was about to use the word intriguing, but it's bigger than that, because, you know, it's more than interesting. It's and it's also more than opaque to me. You know, to be in a conversation it happened last week. So I'm sitting in this 106-degree mineral springs and having a great conversation with this fellow who it's clear we are operating with a completely different set of facts when it comes to all sorts of things. And the first one being COVID. Now, this person, I mean, it wasn't a vaccine conversation or we're not being given all the information conversation. It does not exist. And, you know, it's hard to know how to move it. And, you know, we had a lovely time. and that's a challenging place to be. Again, because I'm sensitive to your time. What's next for the Brave New Films? Or can you talk about that? I don't talk about anything you don't want people to know about.
Yeah.
But are there things that you're exploring that you would either like to speak about or whether you would like to or not, you can speak about?
Well, I think the biggest exploration is maybe the meta one, which is, I mean, we've been very good about changing at Brave New Films.
Yes.
Starting with DVDs that we sold in the lobby after the Iraq film, to outfoxed house parties, when I thought that was a ridiculous idea, but Eli from New Move On gets the credit. You know, constantly changing the way we reach our audience, distribution, if you will. So part of it is, you know, we're spending more time figuring out, is there a way that TikTok can really have an impact, even though it's so short on people? I mean, we're getting numbers. With Josh, who runs social media, is really quite great, but we're now trying to figure out beyond the numbers, you know, what is the impact? And how do we as I keep saying, just because we made a movie doesn't mean the issue is fixed. So Josh also, and we've been talking a lot about how to refresh some of the films, how to take a hour movie and create 3 minutes we can then use to build an audience. So those kind of big discussions are going on. Very specifically, as I was saying, I hope for 2022, we'll be able to do this suppressed and sabotaged movie with the Georgia stuff at the center of it. For the following year, I hope, if this will be bit of a challenge, but to do a movie about a autobiography of Abby Hoffman, which we have, all kinds of fantastic footage we found in libraries and people's attics and amazing stuff. And we're getting the rights to his autobiography from the Sons. So I think that's going to be a, really interesting project that'll speak to many generations.
You just said something, and it was on my list of things that I wanted to ask you about. But so I hope you'll take a little more time. And
Sure.
Impact. How do you measure it? How do you assess it? And I don't mean that in that challenging way. I'm not asking, hey, how do you measure your impact? But how do you assess whether it's been, quote, successful? I mean, it can't just be counting views. That's certainly got to be something. But
yeah, no, you need views to get to.
Yeah.
But well, it's a challenge. I mean, one of the things a friend years ago said it. I'm going to mangle it a bit, but she said, "What you're doing is setting the pathway or the roadmap for many of us on a particular issue." Essentially finding a way to talk about the Koch brothers so we could reach. I mean, I remember sitting in my office, it was like a week, we were tortured by how to talk about the Koch brothers, as they were then called, because Jane Mayer's article in the New Yorker was the inspiration. Yeah. So we found a way to talk about them where it became personal to people, seeing how the Koch brothers' larceny, the Koch brothers' greed, the Koch brothers' ideology was hurting them and their families. So how to talk about it to connect to people's lives is our first job. Now, how do you measure the impact? Very, very hard. So with our screenings program, we can measure it around, we get comments from people who've screened a film. We get some rough numbers around people who take action after screening a film. But how does that compare to the person who came across it on YouTube and then signed up and sent it to his grandmother? Going back to the drones movie, I mean, it was really almost everyone in the world was against us. But then 6 months later, 9 months later, the cover of Newsweek, our film is called Rethink Afghanistan, particularly choosing safe-ish language because, Obama and all of that stuff. Right. Cover of Newsweek, huge cover, Rethinking Afghanistan. So what role did we play in that? I don't know, but I think we had an impact. Mm-hmm. When I was in Afghanistan, and then when I was in Pakistan on drones, interviewing people there and then bringing some of them to the United States so that there was a face on policy. Yes. So it's a long-winded answer to say there's no easy way. A lot of it is subjective. And it's something I hope we'll be able to do better and better, because if you're a funder, if you're a foundation, if you're an individual, why should they give money if the films and the stories and the campaigns are not impacting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some that stand out. It's a perverse measurement, but it's probably real. How much venom have you elicited from the other side? How pissed off was Walmart? How pissed off were the Koch brothers? And you can, and every once in a while, you're lucky enough to find out because they specifically criticize that. And
Oh my goodness. Oh yeah. No, and
Yeah.
Walmart launched that campaign, and they launched their film, the pro Walmart film.
Yeah.
And, the
It's
Koch
like
Brothers.
pennies from heaven.
Yeah. No,
This
there's
is how.
constant stuff. Well, Iraq was the worst in a way, because that's when I got death threats. Since then, it's all been downhill from there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I mean, have you ever? And so, in fact, you did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was the time with toxic patriotism, as I call it, when anybody who disagreed, and when Fox was in its dominance, when there really weren't other voices. Now there's anger, and when we did a short piece around the women who Trump had sexually harassed. We took a lot of grief from some place, I don't know, conservative people who hate women, I'm not sure who, but that got huge media attention. So there was a lot that was stirred up.
Right.
But it's part of the job.
Yeah. No, right. Exactly. Yeah. So what else? You're watching a lot of films. Are some of them like, wow, that's great?
Yes. Yeah. There are, and there are more and more. And when you can do this, you literally can make a documentary on this now, and people are doing it, and they're doing wonderful jobs.
It's astonishing, really.
That's going to change everything. That's going to change it all, because talk about democratizing the means of production, which Marx talked about. This really does it.
Yeah, indeed. Well, that's a silver lining somewhere. Right?
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. It's very exciting what is happening already, and what's going to happen when you see people making the films where I don't know that they're breaking the rules. I think they were never brought up with the rules, which is great. And you see just amazing stuff. I'm on I guess you're allowed to talk about, but I'm in the Academy, so I vote on the Oscars for documentaries. And then I'm in the DGA, which votes. So I get to see tons of films every year. And each year there's different, not everything, a lot of it's by the numbers.
Spinach.
Yeah. And boring. But there's always the breakouts, which are thrilling.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, that's a hopeful thing.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the time to pause and end and
keep hope alive.
And thank you.
Thank you for doing this, and good luck with it. And I'm sure you're going to now focus on how you're going to get zillions of people to see all your podcasts.
Oh, I've already started focusing on that. With that's I'll tell you about that some other time. But
good. Yeah.
Yeah.